this is going to be about the word Romans that Zishan Rafah mentioned in his introducing words to this conference, this word that has so much to do with the Byzantine background that the Quran probably had. So the question is, what did the word Romans mean in the Middle East, in the Near East, in the age when the Quran was composed? A perhaps useful hint is found in two different accounts of the Battle of Yarmouk, the decisive battle where an Arab army defeated the Byzantine troops defending Syria in August 636, and thus practically gained control over the entire land. The Syrian historian Theophilus of Edessa, writing sometime in the 8th century, says that in the Battle of Yarmouk, the Romans of Arabia fought the Arabians of Arabia in the country of the city of Bostra that they call Gabitha on the river named Yarmouk. Now the Muslim historian al-Baladhuri, writing in the 9th century, but certainly basing on much earlier sources, describes things a bit differently. Heraclius gathered big crowds of Romans, Syrians, Mesopotamians, and Armenians, and sent as a vanguard Jabala bin al-Ayham al-Ghassani at the head of the naturalized or northern Arabs, Mustariba of Syria, of the tribes of Lahm, Judam, and others, resolving to fight the Muslims. So the soldiers of the Byzantine camp that Theophilus simply calls the Romans collectively were, according to al-Baladhuri, people coming from all ethnic groups of the Byzantine Near East. Greeks, which is what al-Baladhuri means by Romans, Syrians from Syria itself, from Syro-Palestine, Bilad Asham, as well as from northern Mesopotamia, Armenians, from Armenia itself, as well as from all over the Near East, and Christian Arabs. Such a composition of the Byzantine army seems credible, in fact, despite the fact that we are talking about much later sources that cannot be taken at face value. Theophilus, in particular, has fallen victim to a grave confusion regarding the Battle of Yarmouk. But what does this show us about the word Roman and its usage? First of all, that it could have very different meanings depending on who is talking about whom, in which context, and in what age. As we've just seen, it could just designate the Greeks, like in al-Baladhuri, or it could tacitly include all other peoples of the Byzantine Near East, like in Theophilus of Edessa. The two authors came from very different backgrounds, of course. Theophilus, a Syrian native of Edessa, ended his career as a scholar in the court of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mahdi in Baghdad, but was still a late exponent of that mixture of Syriac Christian culture, Hellenism, and Romanness that was characteristic of the upper classes of Roman Syrian society in late antiquity. Next to composing his influential historiographical work, Theophilus is supposed to have translated the Iliad and the Odyssey into Syriac. So for someone like Theophilus, it was quite natural to consider his fellow Syrians and their Christian neighbors, Armenians and Arabs, as Romans, as people of the late Roman or Byzantine Near East, at least when he was speaking about the past when the Near East was indeed still Byzantine. On the other hand, for al-Baladhuri, an Iranian Muslim scholar with close relationships to the court of the Caliph al-Mamun, the Romans were simply the Greeks that had indeed become the majority in the Byzantine Empire, deprived of its eastern provinces in the 9th century. And of course, they were, the other peoples of the once Byzantine Near East were clearly no Romans, in his view. The same development can be seen in Syriac sources as well, like in the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius that speaks of the kingdom of the Greeks, which is that of the Romans. So from a perspective later than the Arab conquest of the Byzantine Near East, you have also this change in the Bedeutung of the word, in the meaning of the word. You find this same change in Syriac authors as well. But these two different meanings of Romans, just the Greeks or all other peoples of the Byzantine Near East too, are found not just in authors as different as Theophilus and Al-Baladhuri. They appear also in texts of the same provenience and age. These two different meanings of Romans seems to be, at least, this great difference seems to be at least partially a consequence of the fact that the Greeks used consistently this word as their own collective self-designation, their own ethnonym, whereas the Syrians and the other Christian peoples of the Near East would only identify explicitly as Romans in specific cases, as we shall see. The Greeks, as is well known, gradually gave up almost completely the self-designation Hellenes, especially after the conversion of Constantine the Great and the Christianization of the majority of the Greek population of the Eastern Roman Empire. The new ethnonym was Romans. By the early 7th century, Roman was so identified with what we would call Byzantine that even the Greek language itself came to be called Roman language. In the life of St. Athanasius the Persian, which was composed at that time, St. Athanasius the Persian was a Chalcedonian Christian martyr allegedly executed on command of the Shah Khosrau Parvez. We read about an encounter of another Chalcedonian monk with the incurring troops of Heraclius that when our, quote, when our most pious and Christ-loving Emperor Heraclius arrived, together with the army that followed him, this monk saw them and rejoiced with great joy, and he spoke with them in the Roman language. This is of course not a usual usage of this word. As a matter of fact, Yannis Stouraitis, who has drawn attention on this place, says it's particularly a singular usage of the word Roman language to denote Greek. But it did have a reception history, so till the 19th century, most people in Greece would name the Greek language Romaika, so the Roman language. So this seems to have started early on. This self-designation of the Greeks as Romans appears to have signalized at once the voluntary self-identification of the Greeks with an empire that had once conquered them, and it also signalized their distancing from the pagan past, from the word Hellenes, that in the New Testament, as we'll know, denoted the heathens, the adherents of the Greco-Roman heathen religion. However, the term Romaios as a self-designation did not only mean Orthodox Christian. The same person could in some cases be simultaneously acknowledged as an Orthodox Christian without being acknowledged as a Roman, and vice versa. And again, to stress that this identification of Greek and Roman was not as full as one might think, we should say that the word denoted Romans in the sense of Latins, of ancient Romans, as we all would use it, also in the 7th century or in the beginning of it. So we see in the history of Theophylactos Simokatis another place that I find quite interesting. He's writing about some battles between the Byzantine army and the Slavs, and then he writes about a situation where the captain of a Byzantine military unit, quote, whose name was Alexander, commanded the Romans in the ancestral Roman language to dismount from their horses and grasp the enemy danger at close quarters. Now the Romans dismounted from their horses, approached the barricade, and gave and received in turn discharges of missiles. I think it's quite striking here that Latin, because it's Latin that this ancestral Roman language here denotes, is described as the language that was ancestral also to the Greek-speaking soldiers that that were the majority of this army. So this, in spite of the fact that Roman here means Latin, the identification between Romanness and Greekness, so to say, was so deep that one could say that this language was the ancestral language of the Greek-speaking Eastern soldiers that this Alexander was addressing. So, and of course, this original meaning of Roman as Latin survives in numerous other 7th century sources, like the Paschal Chronicle, for example, that uses it in its early parts that cover the ancient Roman history as a word denoting Latin, Roman in the sense of Latin. So we have a certain semantic variety, people using this word as a word denoting Latin, most people using it as a word denoting Greeks, and many people using it as a word that not only designates the Greek people, but also the other Christian peoples of the Byzantine Near East. This semantic variety would sometimes force late antique writers into giving explanations. For instance, Sophronius, the patriarch of Jerusalem in the times of the Arab conquest, would explain in a story about the miracles of the saints Cyrus and John that the latter, Saint John, was a Roman, quote, was a Roman, but not because he stemmed from a city subject to the Romans, but because his homeland and his city was Rome itself. There, that is the Romans' first royal city. Clearly for Sophronius, the common, usual basic definition of Roman was someone who comes from a city subject to the Romans. That's the usual meaning for him. And he contrasts in contradiction he makes a contrast between this usual meaning and the specific meaning coming from Rome itself, stemming from Rome itself, in which St. John was a Roman. Now, on the other hand, this definition, although stemming from a person very well versed in rhetorics like Sophronius was, is a bit nonsensical. Roman is a person stemming from a city subject to the Romans. So Romans are the subject of the Romans. It doesn't really make sense if we don't try to discern between two different meanings of Romans in this same sentence. So obviously, what Sophronius means here is that we have two distinct or homocentric groups of people that are both called Romans, a very broad one that includes all citizens of the entire Roman Empire, and a much narrower one, probably restricted to those that represent the power structures, the ruling elites of the Roman state, and the reinforcement personnel, the administration, the government. So the Romans are those who live in cities under the Roman government. This latter meaning, this more exclusive meaning of Roman as someone having to do with the government, representing the government, is, I think, very important in this context because this is the most common sense of the word Roman in the Syriac sources. So, statistically speaking, so to say, this is by far the most common sense of the word. Syriac authors of the 6th century, of the 7th century, most of the time, when they use the word Romans, most of the time they mean soldiers, judges, magistrates, local representatives of the central power, and so on. The author of this definition, the Patriarch Sophronius, was a native of the city of Damascus, stemming from a family of a considerable social standing. But we don't know what exactly his exact ethnic origins, so it could be that he was half Syriac, half Greek, like many people at that time in this region. But the thing is that his definition fits very well together with what the Syriac sources, in most cases, tell us. But even this broad definition, this double definition, so to say, of Sophronius, Roman as a representative of the state power and Roman as a citizen or subject of the Roman Empire, does not cover the entire breadth of the term Roman. In the age about which we're talking, Roman was an extraordinarily broad, multi-layered term, as Yannis Touraidis again has lately pointed out. The word Roman could mean, when uttered by an inhabitant of Constantinople, Athens, Ephesus, or Pergamon, a Greek-speaking man, a person of Greek culture, of Greek origins, and Orthodox Christian altogether at the same time. It could mean all this without the Greek origins when used by citizens of Alexandria, Antioch, or by an inhabitant of rural Cappadocia. It meant, in most of the cases, a soldier or a person belonging to the government when used by Syrians. And surprisingly enough, in sources coming from Italy and Sicily, from southern Italy and Sicily, in Greek sources, it has never the meaning of Greeks. So it refers to Rome itself and the Latin people of central Italy. So these Greeks there were too near to Rome, too close to Rome to identify as Romans, so to say. So it was really a word with a very, very broad semantic field. So it is true that in the vast majority of cases when Western Syriac authors use the term Romans, they do not refer to themselves, but to someone representing Constantinople or the government. But there are some significant exceptions. So a rather striking case, I think, is John of Ephesus, who repeatedly talks about the polity of us, the Romans. In another context, speaking about the Miaphysite patriarch Theodosius of Alexandria and his lifelong struggle against the imperial Chalcedonian establishment, he says, quote, "And he completed 31 years and a half in the conflicts of persecution and exile from place to place, having also gained distinction and renown all over the polity of us Romans." So it is almost like John wants here to make clear that even the harshest conflict between the Chalcedonians and the Miaphysite is a conflict between Romans. So it doesn't, even the violent fracture of ecclesiastical communio does not infringe the Roman identity common to Chalcedonians and anti-Chalcedonians. It is remarkable that John chooses here the Greek loanword politeia to speak of the polity of us Romans. First of all, because the Greek loanword was loaded with positive connotations of well-ordered statehood and conscious citizenship since Plato and Aristotle, and because it became the Greek rendering of the Roman res publica, and then the word that Byzantine orators like Eunapios of Sardes would mostly choose when wanting to allude to the entire political ideology that was inherent to the notion of the Roman Empire. By using this particular word, politeia of us Romans, John highlights even more his ostentatious identification as Roman. Other examples could follow. So this kind, but in most cases, when Syriac authors would identify as Romans, it's collective. They speak of us. On a first-person, singular level, when speaking of themselves alone, members of the West Syrian elite like John would call themselves rather philoromaioi, friends of the Romans rather than Romans. However, this was not without exceptions in other places and in other languages of the Near East. And Zishan Rafa has drawn my attention to the inscript of Abraha, where he identifies himself in first person, as I think, as Roman, according to the translation that I found. Again, when referring to the Arab troops that were allied with the Byzantine army, the Syriac authors, like Bar Sauma of Nisibis in his first letter, refers to them as the Arabs of the Romans. And again, referring to the Arabs that fought on the side by side with the Persians against the Byzantine army as the Arabs of the Persians. So he doesn't call them Romans just like this, but Arabs of the Romans. So just a short, 2 or 3 short remarks about a sort of an explanation why the Syrians, despite their so intimate identification with the Byzantine Empire, would not call themselves most of the times Romans, and would do so only in exceptional cases. So the most common self-identification was, of course, Syrians, Suryaye. But this word itself, in the West Syriac sources of the 6th century, with hardly any exceptions that I know of, denotes only Syrians living in the Byzantine Empire. So Syrians, the so-called East Syrians, the Nestorians, the Syriac-speaking people who lived in the Iranian Empire are never called Syrians, Suryaye. They are called Persians, Farsaye. They call themselves, so the Eastern Syrians would in most cases identify as Orientals, Madnahaye, so the people, the Easterners. Not without exception, in several sense lives, they also describe a fellow East Syriac as Persian. So sense lives written by East Syriac authors about the life of East Syriac sense very often begin with the line, Saint XY was a Persian. In exactly the same way, hagiographic texts coming from the West Syriac Church would begin with the line, Saint XY was Syrian. So the word Syrian itself, I want to stress, contained, in a certain sense, the meaning citizen of the Roman Empire. So this broader meaning of Roman. Perhaps it's not irrelevant to mention that it was also not a Syriac word. It was a loan word, so to say, from the Greek word to speak of the to speak about Syrians. So it was itself. I mean, if you adopt by yourself the word by which other people name you, this shows something as well about your attitude towards these other people. And just another point, I want, so these are just some examples to show once again how strong this self-identification of the Western Syrians was with the Roman Empire. I won't read everything, but these 2 lines, it's about some riots in the city of Edessa, where the people are rioting against the bishop, and they shout on the streets, "This is the city of the Augusti," or "Long live the Roman Empire." Romania is the word. So it was nothing unusual, so to say, in the capital of the Syriac civilization, in the cultural capital of the Syriac world, that Edessa was, to have people in the streets proclaiming their loyalty, so to say, to the Roman Empire. Their identification as Romans, actually. And the other text, the text above that I don't read, it simply shows the same thing, and also the contradiction, the opposition to the other Syrians in the Persian Empire. Actually, some sources from the 5th century show us that West Syrians in Edessa could even understand that someone was East Syrian, so Persian, on the street just by seeing him. Perhaps they were dressed differently. So there was a deep cultural rift between the East Syriac and the West Syriac world, that was solely conditioned by by the frontier between the Roman Empire and the Iranian Empire. And comparable processes were going on among the Armenian people as well. So I won't go into detail into this, but it's roughly it's acknowledged generally that the western part of the Armenians were rather tending towards loyalty to the Byzantine Empire and identifying themselves with the Byzantine state, whereas Eastern Armenians were looking towards Persia in the 6th century. And I just wanted to show a couple of pictures that show that illustrate this. This is taken from this is a mosaic of Madaba that shows the 3 cities: Madaba, the small one, Rome, the big one to the left, and a city that couldn't be identified with any certainty until now. There are some suggestions, but no suggestions seem satisfactory to me. Its name is Gregoria, and there is no such city that we know of. But the important thing is that Rome is the big figure to the left, and it's present, so to say, even so far away from Italy in the art, in the Syriac art of that age. And then just by the way, another example, one of the best mosaics, so to say, produced in Edessa at that time. It's a scene where Prometheus is attending while Zeus and Hera, Zeus is Mar Alahe, the Lord of all gods, are constructing people, so to say, are constructing humans. Just as an example of the degree to which, even in the 6th century, in the Christian Edessa, Greek-Roman culture was present, and even in the houses of Christians, I suppose. So, how can a better understanding or a broader understanding of what Romans meant in the late antique Near East contribute to a better understanding of the Qur'an and its multi-layered contexts? To begin with, there are, I think, some general consequences concerning, or some general things that one could have in mind while dealing with Quranic intertexts. First of all, when looking for Quranic intertexts, one could be more cautious when separating between Byzantine Greek sources on the one hand and Syriac sources on the other hand. Syriac sources were Byzantine sources at that time, and the language barrier was really low and easy to cross. So in most cases, when we can see that a Greek source is reflected in some Quranic verses, it is very, like in liturgical texts, for example, it is very easy to suppose that there was a doublet, that there was a version of it in Syriac going around, or that there were people who could both understand the Greek and render it even orally in Syriac or in Arabic, for that matter. I think that this harmonizes to a certain degree with the insights of Quranic scholarship in the last decades that also show that what the Quran reflects as Christianity, as Christian theology, is in most cases really mainstream, be it Miaphysite or even Aphthartodocet. It comes from the main stream of Christian theology of that age and not from marginal sects or so. So I think this combines very well with the situation that we see in the Near East of that time, where Greeks, Syriacs, Armenians, and all the Christian Arabs are really closely interconnected and in close communication with one another, which makes it really difficult to suppose that there were such barriers that could allow places to stay, specific places on the map to stay completely out of this communication of ideas and thoughts. so Romanists had united all these traditions to a point, I think, that it is difficult to suppose that entire lands or countries could stay out of this information flow, so to say. But let us take a closer look at the one Quranic verse where the Romans are mentioned by name. It appears that the primary, the most direct sense of Romans in these verses is that of the Byzantine soldiers and officials, the Byzantine troops that had lost a battle against the Sasanian armies. So we have, I think, again, at a first level at least, this narrow sense of Roman that we find in Sophronius of Jerusalem and in most Syriac authors, who in most cases use this word, as I've said, to refer to representatives of the Byzantine government, of the Byzantine Empire, in this case, and very, very common to soldiers, officials, generals, and so on. So in this case, this seems to me to fit well together, that this should be the primary meaning of Romans, the Roman soldiers. But again, by showing a certain solidarity with the defeated Romans and rejoicing on their foreseen future victory, these verses seem to imply at least that this solidarity does not have to do exclusively with the soldiers themselves that lost that battle, but with the entire Roman world, right, with the entire Byzantine Empire. And in this sense, we could have also this second, very broad sense that Sophronius gives to the word. So Romans are the subjects, the citizens of the Roman Empire. And again, another point of view, the Roman taking the narrow sense of the Roman troops that were actually defeated, these were composed in most cases in the battles between Byzantines and Persians, were composed not only of Greeks, of course, but also of all the other ethnicities of the Near East, Syrians, Armenians, Christian Arabs, and so on. So you also have this multi-ethnic aspect in there. So this place, the opening verses of the Surah Ar-Rum, is the only instance in the Quran where the Romans are mentioned by name. And in this case, where the Romans are mentioned by name, it is to express solidarity with them. It is in a positive sense. This could or should be no coincidence, but what could it imply? Let us turn, for example, to another Quranic place that refers to the Byzantines according to the interpretation of Zishan Ghaffar, even without naming them, and has to do with the same geopolitical context of the Byzantine-Persian wars in a later stage. They are indeed infidels, those who say God is Christ, the Son of Mary. Say, who then would be able to do anything against God if you wanted to bring to naught Christ, the Son of Mary and his mother, and all those that are on earth? Here, according to Ghaffar's interpretation, the Quranic preacher criticizes what he considers to be an undue and unwarranted use of Christian theology by Heraclius's court, in particular of high Christology and Marian piety. Heraclius and his circle forged in this way a full-fledged political theology, a theologically based imperial propaganda put in the service of a campaign against the Persians, and this in a time when the tide was turning in favor of the Byzantine army. This is then what the aforementioned Quranic verse condemns. But why does the Quran choose to name the Romans when solidarizing with them and to leave them unnamed when criticizing them? To begin with, one could invoke the general tendency of the Quranic style, it seems, to comment on contemporary historical events in a very indirect manner by way of allusions, adumbrations, and metaphors, rather than by calling things by name. And it also seems to me that in most cases when the Quran mentions a person, or in our case a group of persons by name, it is in a positive sense. So this could even strengthen the positive meaning that is given to this, the positive light cast on the Byzantines by the Surah Ar-Rum. But then the case of the Surah Ar-Rum calls for an explanation, for a further explanation. The following is just a first try. Could it be that? Could it be the case that this difference, so naming the Romans when solidarizing with them, leaving them unnamed when criticizing them, is somehow meant to show that the solidarity with the Romans, as declared expressis verbis in the Surah Ar-Rum, remains valid, so to say, even in the face of critique as sharp as in the 5th Surah? It might seem that the Surah Ar-Rum, by naming the Romans, refers to all of them, to the Byzantine world, the Christian Byzantine world taken as a whole, and thus states the solidarity of the Quranic community or its leadership to this world as a whole, probably because of their shared monotheistic creed contraposed to the Zoroastrian Iranians construed as pagans. On the other hand, when the Quran condemns, like in Surah 5:17, a certain form of Byzantine political theology, a certain imperial ideology abusing Christian faith and Marian piety, then the Quran attacks the abuse in itself, as well as those responsible for it, leaving them unnamed, but not all Romans, not the Roman world as a collective entity, not the entire Roman Church. Could it be then that perhaps the Quran here shows a certain awareness of the fact that this kind of propagandistic abuse of Christology and Marian piety actually came from the imperial court? It came from a certain circle of court writers and court theologians, and was in no way representative of the greater Byzantine world, of the Byzantine Christianity taken as a whole, let alone of the theological tradition of the Church Fathers, the only tradition that could claim true authority in the entire Byzantine world, and that had never made any concessions whatsoever to imperial theologies or political theologies for that matter, except if we're ready to consider as a speaker of the patristic tradition people like Sergius of Constantinople, or back in the past Eusebius of Caesarea, whom Byzantine patristic tradition, as voiced in the 7th century by Saint Maximus the Confessor, clearly saw as the exact opposite of itself. Could this be a viable way to understand why the Quran names the Romans in the surah named after them, but leaves them unnamed when wanting to denounce as abusive certain attitudes of certain Romans towards theology, politics, and war? Yeah, if yes, then this might seem to do justice to the fact that the Byzantine theological tradition of the Church Fathers never gave place to the kind of political abuse of theology that is condemned in the Quran. But, yeah, if this is the case, it's just a thought experiment. It has to remain open. Thank you very much.